The knock wasn't friendly. It wasn't the kind of knock you hear when a neighbor wants to borrow sugar. No, this one was sharp, deliberate, entitled. The kind of knock from someone who thought they owned the place. Or at least thought they should. I stood in the hallway, staring at the door like it might bite me if I got too close. Something about that knock felt like a warning. But then again, my ex-wife, Rachel, was never one for subtlety. Sighing, I pulled open the door. And there she was. Rachel stood in front of me, dressed in designer clothes I knew she couldn't afford, her sunglasses perched on top of her head like she was auditioning for some reality show. And beside her, grinning like he had just won the lottery, stood Mark, the man she had left me for. His smirk was the kind that made you want to punch first and ask questions later. He didn't say a word at first, just looked me up and down like I was something he scraped off his shoe. Rachel wasted no time. "Well, Matt," she said, stepping forward. "Aren't you going to invite us in?" I crossed my arms, leaning against the doorframe. "Depends. Did you bring a gift?" "That's what guests usually do." Her smile faltered, just for a second, but she recovered quickly, cranking up the fake charm. "We're not here for pleasantries. We're here for business." Mark finally spoke, his voice dripping with mock sincerity. "Your father's estate. We have some rightful claims, and it's only fair we settle this like adults." I blinked, then laughed. "You're joking, right?" Rachel gave me a patient look, like I was a child throwing a tantrum. "Matt, don't be unreasonable. You know how close I was to your father. He adored me." "Yeah, until he didn't," I shot back. "Don't rewrite history just because you want a payday." Mark stepped in, his grin widening. "Listen, Matt." "It's Matthew," I corrected. "Only my friends call me Matt, and last I checked, you're not one of them." His jaw tightened, but he pressed on. "This house is worth millions. Rachel was part of this family for years, and as her husband, I think it's only right we discuss what portion of the estate belongs to her, and by extension, to us." The sheer audacity of the man was almost impressive. Almost. "You're not getting a cent," I said flatly. Before I could say anything less polite, another voice chimed in from behind me. "Well, this is a fascinating conversation." Rachel stiffened. Mark's smirk wavered. And I smiled. Because stepping into view, leather briefcase in hand, was Eleanor Price, my lawyer. And she was about to ruin their day. Rachel's smile faltered, and Mark's smug expression twitched as Eleanor stepped beside me. She was dressed as sharply as ever, sleek black suit, heels that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage, and an air of quiet confidence that could level a battlefield. "Thomas, aren't you going to introduce me?" she asked, adjusting the strap of her leather briefcase. Mark's eyes flickered with unease, but he recovered quickly, turning his charm up a notch. "And you are?" he asked, voice teetering between curiosity and irritation. "Eleanor Price," she said smoothly, offering a polite but pointed smile. "Matthew's attorney." Rachel's expression cracked for the first time. "Attorney?" Eleanor nodded. "Yes. You see, unlike some people, Matthew prefers to be prepared." I smirked as I stepped aside, letting Eleanor fully into the doorway. "And I had a feeling you'd try something like this." Eleanor opened her briefcase with a crisp snap, pulling out a folder thicker than a college textbook. "Your timing is impeccable," she said, flipping through a few pages. "Matthew and I were just reviewing the details of Mr. Callahan's will. You know, the one that explicitly outlines who does and does not have a legal claim to his estate." The color drained from Rachel's face. Mark, on the other hand, puffed out his chest like a rooster in a barnyard. "This isn't over," he said, voice tight. "We have rights. We'll see you in court if we have to." Eleanor's smile was pure sugar. "Oh, I'm counting on it." Rachel grabbed Mark's arm, her composure barely holding together. "Let's go," she muttered, dragging him down the driveway. Mark threw one last glare over his shoulder. "This isn't the end, Matthew. We'll be back." Looking forward to it, I called after them before shutting the door. I turned to Eleanor, who was already flipping through her notes. "Well," she said, arching an eyebrow. "That was entertaining. But you'd better buckle up, Matthew. This is just the beginning." And deep down, I knew she was right. After Rachel and Mark's dramatic exit, I slumped onto the couch while Eleanor calmly set her briefcase on the coffee table. "You were right," I admitted, rubbing my temples. "They didn't waste any time." Eleanor pulled out a thick file and slid it toward me. "And neither did your father." I stared at the folder. "What is this?" "Evidence," Eleanor said, crossing her legs. "Your father didn't just write a will. He built a fortress. Every clause, every contingency, all designed to protect his estate from people like Rachel and Mark. He knew they'd try something like this. A knot formed in my stomach as I flipped open the file. It wasn't just a will, it was a war plan. Legal documents, financial records, even private correspondence my father had quietly compiled over the years. He saw this coming? I asked, my voice tight. Eleanor nodded. From the moment Rachel walked out on you, he started putting plans in motion. He suspected she was only in it for the money, and your divorce confirmed his fears. Then when Mark entered the picture, your father became even more cautious. He didn't trust either of them. I exhaled sharply, leaning back in my chair. My father had always been one step ahead, even in death. So, what's the plan now? I asked. Eleanor tapped her pen against her notebook. First, we make sure the will stands exactly as your father intended. Second, we expose Rachel and Mark for who they really are. And finally, we ensure that everything your father built stays in the family. Her confidence was reassuring, but it didn't make the situation any less infuriating. Rachel and Mark weren't just greedy, they were shameless. My father hadn't even been gone long enough for the flowers on his grave to wilt, and they were already circling like vultures. What do we have on them? I asked, needing to know how strong our case really was. Eleanor's lips curved into a knowing smile. Quite a bit, actually. Your father was thorough. He hired private investigators after your divorce, and the results, well, let's just say they're damning. She pulled out another folder and handed it to me. I hesitated for a moment before opening it. Inside were photos Rachel and Mark meeting with various people. Some were lawyers. Others, unrecognizable. One picture showed them at a bank, holding what looked like legal documents. Another captured them in a dimly lit restaurant, speaking with someone who suspiciously resembled a private investigator of their own. What am I looking at? I asked, my throat dry. Proof that they've been planning this for months, Eleanor explained. Mark, in particular, has been aggressive, trying to find loopholes, weak points in the will they could exploit. I clenched my jaw, flipping through the photos. Rachel and I had spent years together. We weren't perfect, but I had always believed that, at the very least, she had once cared about me. Now it seemed like every moment of our marriage had been part of some larger scheme. And the will? I asked, trying to keep my anger in check. How airtight is it? As airtight as it gets. Eleanor leaned forward, her eyes sharp. Your father included a no-contest clause. If they challenged the will, they risked forfeiting any inheritance entirely. A grim sense of satisfaction settled over me. My father hadn't just been cautious, he'd been brilliant. Rachel and Mark thought they could outsmart him. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. The day of the will reading arrived, and the tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. Rachel and Mark sat across from me at the long conference table, looking far too confident for my liking. Rachel was dressed to impress, her makeup flawless, her jewelry understated but expensive looking. She had perfected the image of the grieving, dignified widow, except she had never been my father's widow. Mark, on the other hand, lounged in his chair, exuding the arrogance of someone who thought they had already won. Eleanor sat to my left, calm and composed, her briefcase resting beside her. Across the room, the executor of my father's will, Mr. Warren, adjusted his glasses and prepared to begin. Rachel leaned forward, practically purring. Let's get this over with, shall we? We all know why we're here. I didn't respond. Instead, I glanced at Eleanor, who gave me a small, subtle nod. We were ready. Mr. Warren cleared his throat. This will was finalized 6 months before Mr. Callahan's passing. It clearly outlines the division of assets, including the estate, business holdings, and financial trusts. Rachel's painted lips curled into a satisfied smile. Wonderful, she said. I'm sure Richard left instructions that reflect his love and affection for everyone involved. I barely stopped myself from rolling my eyes. Mr. Warren continued, the initial division is as follows. The Callahan estate, including this property, is to be allocated 60% to Matthew Callahan and 40% to me. Rachel leaned back in triumph. Exactly as I expected. Mr. Warren didn't even flinch. Contingent upon the fulfillment of specific conditions outlined in an addendum added 3 days before Mr. Callahan's death. Rachel's smile froze. What conditions? Mr. Warren glanced at Eleanor, giving her the floor. She wasted no time. The conditions involve a clause requiring a full investigation into any parties attempting to claim inheritance under questionable pretenses. Mark sat up straighter, his smirk fading. What does that mean? Eleanor's voice was steady, but her words hit like a hammer. It means that any attempt to manipulate Mr. Callahan or his estate activates the no contest clause. If you're caught trying to deceive your way into an inheritance, you lose everything. Rachel's composure cracked for the first time. This is ridiculous, she snapped. We've done nothing wrong. Eleanor raised an eyebrow, almost amused. Really? Then perhaps you'd like to explain these. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents and photographs, sliding them across the table. Rachel hesitated, but Mark grabbed them, flipping through with increasing panic. What the hell is this? Eleanor leaned forward. Evidence. She let the words sink in before continuing. Photos of the two of you meeting with lawyers to discuss contesting the will before Mr. Callahan even passed. Bank statements showing suspicious transfers from Rachel's account during her marriage to Matthew. Emails in which Mark pressured Richard's staff for information about the estate. Shall I go on? Rachel's face turned pale. These are lies, she said, her voice shaky. Fabricated to make us look bad. Lies. Eleanor echoed, pulling out another document. This is a signed statement from one of Richard's nurses detailing how you, Rachel, attempted to bribe her for details about his health and the will. Still think it's fabricated? Mark's composure crumbled. He threw the photos back onto the table. This is a setup, he spat. You're trying to trap us. Eleanor's expression remained icy. No, Mark. You trapped yourselves. For the first time since walking into the room, Rachel looked genuinely afraid. But the show wasn't over yet, because Eleanor had one last card to play. Rachel's hands trembled as she shuffled through the incriminating photos. Mark, no longer smirking, sat stiffly beside her, his knuckles white as he clenched the table's edge. But Eleanor wasn't done. Not yet. You see, she said, sliding yet another document across the table, Richard Callahan was a meticulous man. He knew exactly who he was dealing with. Rachel's head snapped up. That's not true, she hissed. He loved me. Eleanor didn't even blink. He loved his son more. Mr. Warren cleared his throat. If I may, Miss Price? Eleanor gave him a small nod, leaning back in her chair as he pulled out a USB drive. Before his passing, Mr. Callahan recorded a statement regarding his estate. With the court's permission, I'd like to play it now. Rachel's face lost all color. Mark shifted in his chair, his knee bouncing under the table. You've got to be kidding me. But it was too late. The clerk inserted the USB, and a moment later, my father's voice filled the room. If you're watching this, he began, then my suspicions have been confirmed. Rachel and Mark have attempted to claim a part of my estate through manipulation and deceit. To them, I say this, your greed has blinded you. You thought this was about money. You were wrong. Rachel inhaled sharply, her chest rising and falling in quick, shallow breaths. Mark clenched his jaw, shaking his head. This is a joke. But my father wasn't finished. To my son, Matthew, he continued, I leave not just my estate, but the responsibility of upholding this family's legacy. I know this battle won't be easy, but I also know you'll handle it with integrity. I am proud of you. The room fell silent as the video ended. Rachel exhaled, her breath shaky. She looked at me then, but I saw no love, no remorse, just the cold realization that she had lost. Mr. Warren straightened his glasses. Given the overwhelming evidence presented here today, the court will enforce the no contest clause. Rachel and Mark Mitchell are officially disqualified from any claim to the Callahan estate. The gavel struck. It was over. Rachel let out a choked gasp, covering her mouth as if to stifle a scream. Mark, ever the coward, slumped in his chair like a deflated balloon. As the room emptied, Eleanor stood, tucking her papers neatly into her briefcase. Well, she said, smirking as she glanced at Rachel and Mark. That was fun. I turned to her. What happens now? She gave me a knowing look. Now? We let them deal with the consequences. Rachel and Mark had tried to steal my father's legacy. Instead, they had destroyed their own. Rachel and Mark had lost. But the storm wasn't over. In the days following the will reading, the media picked up the story. Reports of Rachel's failed attempt to manipulate my father's estate spread like wildfire. Mark, ever the opportunist, was caught on a hot mic ranting about how he had wasted years on a plan that had backfired. The headlines were brutal. Gold digger ex-wife exposed in Callahan estate scandal. Fraud, lies, and a failed scheme. Inside the Callahan will contest. It didn't take long for the fallout to reach them. Rachel lost everything. Her reputation, her social circles, even her apartment. Turns out, she had been living way beyond her means, assuming she'd be getting a piece of the estate. When that didn't happen, creditors came knocking. Mark, proving once again that he was nothing more than a parasite, turned on her the moment things got rough. He took off, cutting his losses. From what Eleanor told me, he was trying to negotiate a deal to avoid legal trouble for some of the financial errors they had made together. In short, he was ready to throw Rachel under the bus. Karma had arrived. But while their world was crumbling, mine was just beginning to rebuild. A few days after the trial, Eleanor called me. "There's one last thing," she said. "Something your father left for you. It's not in the will. It's separate." She arrived later that evening, holding a small leather-bound journal and a sealed envelope. "This was your father's," she said, handing me the journal first. "He kept it during his last year." Knowing what was coming, I ran my fingers over the worn leather, feeling the weight of it. My father had always been a private man, preferring to write his thoughts rather than speak them aloud. "What's in it?" I asked. Eleanor gestured for me to open it. His handwriting filled the pages. March 15th. "Rachel isn't who Matthew thinks she is. I wanted to believe their love was real, but it's clear she only sees him as a stepping stone. I've begun preparing just in case." April 2nd. "Mark is dangerous. He doesn't care about Rachel beyond what she can give him. He's already planning how to manipulate my estate. I won't let them win." I swallowed hard, turning page after page. My father had seen it all, the deceit, the manipulation, long before I had. At the very back of the journal, a single line stood out, written in bold, deliberate letters. "The truth always comes to light." I closed the journal, my chest tight. Eleanor handed me the envelope next. Inside was a letter, written in my father's familiar scrawl. "My son, if you're reading this, the battle has begun. I'm sorry you have to face this, but I want you to remember something. You are not alone. I've given Eleanor everything she needs to ensure the truth comes out. Trust her. Trust yourself. You are stronger than you think. This was never about money, Matthew. It was about integrity, about protecting what truly matters. In the study drawer, you'll find one last surprise. Something I left for you, knowing you would find your own way forward. With love and faith in you. Dad." I set the letter down, my throat thick with emotion. Even from beyond the grave, my father had been guiding me. The next morning, I went to my father's study and opened the drawer he mentioned. Inside was a deed, a piece of land, adjacent to the Callahan estate. Attached to it was a small note. "This is for you, Matthew. I bought it because I knew you'd make something beautiful out of it. Whatever you choose to do, know that I will always be with you." I sat back, overwhelmed by the depth of my father's foresight. He hadn't just left me an inheritance. He had left me a future, and I knew exactly what to do with it. Months passed. The land my father left me transformed. What was once an empty field became Callahan Gardens, a sprawling, vibrant space filled with the flowers and trees my father had loved. It wasn't just a tribute to him. It was a place for the community, a place where people could come, reflect, and heal. Eleanor stood beside me on opening day, watching as families wandered the garden paths, children laughing as they ran between the rows of flowers. "He'd be proud," she said softly. I nodded. "I hope so." She smiled. "I know so." As the sun dipped below the horizon, I traced my fingers over the small plaque near the entrance. "In loving memory of Richard Callahan, a man who taught us that even in the hardest soil, something beautiful can grow." I took a deep breath, letting the past fade behind me. Rachel and Mark were nothing more than ghosts now, reminders of a life I had outgrown. What mattered was here. This garden, this legacy. Justice had been served. But more importantly, I had found peace.